I want to add event handlers for each of the up, down, and move events that Gamepad emits. For now, I will just simply add handlers that return some of the same data received. This may not seem overly useful right now, but these handlers will actually position me to manipulate the data a little later when I map the axis and button IDs to the actual names of the controls. In order for my new module to emit events of its own, I need to pull in the event emitter class provided by Node.js. And then in order for my module to be recognized as an event emitter, I need to pull in the util module as well. This module contains an inherits function I can use to tell Node that an Xbox 360 controller object is an event emitter, or inherits functionality from the event emitter, so I'll just tack that on below the constructor function. Alright, now I can start pulling over the event handlers I added in the test.js file and creating new handlers for my controller. I'll just cut them from here, and then paste them into the init function, since that's where I'll be wiring them up. I typically prefer named functions over anonymous functions, so as I rewrite these handlers, I will be pulling the original anonymous handlers out into named functions. Starting with the move handler, I'll create a new function called handleAxisMove that has the same parameters as the original handler. As I mentioned a bit ago, I'm just going to emit some of the same data being passed into the handler for now, and we'll morph this into a more useful function throughout the rest of the course. In order to emit an event, I just need to call the emit function with the name of the event I want to emit and the corresponding arguments to be passed to any handlers listening for this event. Since I set up the constructor function to inherit from the event emitter class, I can just call this.emit. I'll just use the same name for the event, so I will pass in move as the event name, and then pass along the axis ID and value. I'm not going to pass along the ID argument because it just corresponds to the device triggering the initial event, which should be an Xbox 360 controller. Of course, at this point, it's not guaranteed that this type of controller triggered the event, as my module is still generic enough to handle other types of controllers, but I will be tackling that issue a little later on, so for now, I will just swallow up the ID argument and not do anything with it. If you're pretty familiar with JavaScript, you'll know that the this keyword is dynamic and can refer to different things depending on how it's used and what object called the function in which it's used. My intent is that an instance of an Xbox 360 controller will be emitting the event, but that's not going to be the case here, as this will actually refer to Gamepad since the handleAxisMove function will be wired up as the event handler for Gamepad's move event. So, in order to ensure that the controller object is what's calling the emit function, I can set up a variable outside of the handler function, which I will just call self and assign it this. And then I will just replace the this keyword in the new handler with self. Alright, now I can just replace the current handler for the move event with my new named function. I'm pretty much going to be doing the same thing for the up and down handlers, so I will just copy the handleAxisMove handler and paste it twice. For the first one, I will change the function name to handleButtonReleased. And instead of move, I will have this one emit an event called released, as opposed to the original event name of up that Gamepad emits, because it seems a little more descriptive to me as to what's actually happening. I need to change the parameters of my new handler here to match those of the original handler, so I'll nuke the axis ID and value parameters and add a num parameter, which will also need to be emitted as well. Now I have a wrapped handler that will emit a released event whenever a button is released on the actual controller. I just need to wire it up now in place of the anonymous handler for Gamepad's up event. Alright, now for the second copied handler, I'll change the name of it to handleButtonPressed. And I'll just follow the same pattern as I did for the last one, where I replace the axis ID and value parameters with a num parameter, which will also be emitted. And then I'll just change the move event name to pressed. Alright, now I just need to wire this new handler up in place of the anonymous function currently occupying the space for Gamepad's down event. The last thing I need to do before hooking up my new module to the test file and seeing how this bad boy functions is I need to pull over the two set interval statements from the test file for detecting new devices and processing events. To recap what these statements are doing, the first line that calls process events basically pulls for any events triggered by the physical controller. If any button presses or axis movements are detected, Gamepad will then emit those through the appropriate events. The detect devices line just simply pulls for connected and disconnected devices every half a second. One final thing I'm going to do in here at the tail end of the init call is just emit a new event that I'll call initialized so that any applications using this module can know when everything has been wired up and the controller is ready for use. Now in order to actually test out the new module, I need to pull it into my test file. Now there's just one for loop left in here that didn't get copied over during the event handler rewrite, which I'll need in a later lesson, so I'll just comment it out here for now so that it doesn't execute. All it's doing anyway is just logging device information to the console, so it shouldn't have any impact on the ability to detect and handle events. And just like I did with the gamepad module, I will just need to require my new module first. Now since my module is not set up like an official npm package, I need to specify the file path in the require call instead of just passing in the name of the module, which resides in the same folder here as my test file. And if you're curious, I'm using the standard Pascal naming convention here for the variable name to indicate that what's being returned from the require call is a constructor function. Now I need an instance of my controller, so I will do that by calling new Xbox 360 controller and assigning that to a variable called controller. The first thing I will do here is wire up event handlers for each of the events the controller emits, and then we'll just simply log statements to the console. I'll add a handler for the initialized event that will just let us know that the controller has been initialized. Now I'd also like to know when an access control has been moved, so I'll add another handler for the move event, which will take in the access ID and its positional value, and just log those to the console as well. I'm also going to add handlers for the button pressed and released events, which will just log the ID of the buttons triggering the events followed by the appropriate action performed. And now the final thing I need to do is call the init function on the controller so that all of the event handlers are wired up and gamepad is initialized. Alright, now if I just switch back over to PowerShell and run this, I should see messages logged to the terminal window for each of the events. There's the initialized message, as well as the bogus output from each of the access controls, which will be cleaned up later, so don't worry about that at this time. Now if I press some of the buttons on my controller, I should be able to see the pressed and released events being handled for each of them. Alright, and if I move some of the access controls, I should be able to see the ID of the access triggering the event, as well as its positional value. Alright, well it looks like I ported everything over correctly, so let's move on now to see how to map each of the access and button control IDs to more human readable names, so that we can know just by looking at the output which controls are actually triggering the events.